Hello, everybody. Welcome to Project HR, a podcast dedicated to building better workplaces. I'm your host, Beth Pilgreen, and today we'll be talking about the future, your company's future, and one of the most critical ways HR ensures a company's future success. I'm talking about succession planning, and never has there been a more important time to have a solid succession plan in place. Today, we stand on the edge of a major generational shift within our workplaces. Baby boomers have already begun their collective transition into retirement. And once it hits its stride, companies that don't have a plan in place will struggle. Now, if that statement makes you feel a little concerned, never fear, because today we are joined by Jim Bitterle, Managing Partner from EDSI. EDSI is a national workforce development, talent solutions, and consulting company that specializes in helping organizations attract, train, and retain top talent. All critical elements in any company's succession plan. And yes, he's going to help us all put a little success in our succession planning. Jim, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you, Beth. Glad to be here.
Well, let's start off with just a quick explanation of what succession planning is and why it's important, even outside the generational shift we just discussed.
Well, succession planning is really just a process for business continuity. It really ensures that you have the right people in the right place with the right knowledge, skills, and abilities to ensure that as people retire or leave your organization, that the organization is able to carry forward and achieve its goals.
Okay, so why do you think it's so important that we have a plan? Why can't we simply just replace workers as they leave?
Well, there are really two sides to that question. And the first piece is when we look at companies transitioning ownership, we see that there's a very high failure rate with companies transitioning from one generation to the next. Imagine a small company that has gone for 25 years and suddenly it transitions to the next generation of ownership. 60% of those companies fail within just a few short years.
Really?
Yeah, and when you look at generational transfer to third generation, the failure rate is almost 90%. And so it really comes down to, in that situation, not picking the right leaders and not having them prepared to take over that role. So it can be devastating to the organization from an ownership transition. Then when you look at key positions within the organization transitioning, once again, it can have a very significant effect on your ability to provide the service, the quality, or the products that you need to your customers, because you can lose critical knowledge, critical abilities, and critical skills.
Okay, so many people see succession planning as primarily a C-suite concern and not an HR concern, while still others see precisely the opposite. So, in your opinion, whose responsibility is it?
Well, that's a really good question because typically it falls upon HR. And HR really often case spearheads it and probably does the best job of spearheading it, right? But you have to have the C-level support because it's always something that everybody always thinks that we can do that tomorrow. It's a lower priority right now because there's always a bigger fire to fight. But you have to have the commitment from the owner, from the C-level suite. You have to have the budget and the resources to get it done right. And usually HR is the group that needs to drive and facilitate the process. But without the support at the C-level suite, it's going to be a difficult process to get through.
Right. Well, in HR too, I mean, going back to talking about the urgency behind succession planning and how many people don't put it as a priority, that is exactly where HR can come in and help shoulder this burden for the people that are too busy for it. You know what I mean?
Yes.
Right. Well, are there any other misconceptions about succession planning?
Yeah, I think you hit on the biggest, right? And that is that it's just for the top level because there are so many critical roles. Imagine in a lot of organizations, you might have one or two salespeople that carry 80% of your sales and own critical relationships. So it's really important throughout the organization to identify what are those critical roles and those positions and those people, right? Because without them, it can devastate an organization. So that's a critical misconception that it's only at the top level that we need to prepare succession plans. I think the bigger issue that we see is too many organizations look at it and say, yeah, we kind of know who's going to take over these roles, and they just simply don't do it thoroughly. The problem is then when they really truly need it, they might know who's going to jump into that role, but that person's not prepared. And when that person's not prepared, usually bad things happen.
Right. Yeah, because I think it all goes back to a lack of urgency with the lack of preparation. Why would you think that something would ever happen to where we would need to bring somebody in to fill this position?
That's right.
Yeah. You kind of just answered my next question, which was going to be what role should fall under the scope of this plan. But it seems like everybody who plays a critical role, they all need to have this type of planning. Is that right?
That's correct. And it really is interesting because you may have financial people, sales and marketing folks, technical people that can have a dramatic impact on the organization. Let me give you an example.
Okay.
In a $3 billion global chemical company as the president of the Asia Pacific region. And we had one individual that was our chief polymer chemist. And this particular chemist was really the only one that understood certain things about the types of polymers that we used in a number of our products. And that individual was recruited away from our company.
Hmm.
We lost that person in a very short period of time. It was devastating to our ability to develop and support some of the products that we had globally. And this was one chemist.
Oh, my.
So it can be, it's one of those things that you have to pay close attention to who has critical information, critical skills, or critical abilities. Without it, you can be in deep trouble.
Yeah. And to also keep that person very happy,
Yeah.
to where they're not going to get a better offer and leave you. If they're that critical, I would want to keep them the happiest.
Beth, that's such a great point because, up until, look, we've had 11 years of growth in this country. And up until February of this year, we had um, essentially the more open positions in America than we had people to fill those positions. So we basically have more jobs than we have people.
Wow.
So it's really critical that you create a great culture because without that great culture and that great, what we call a talent ecosystem, um, succession then becomes absolutely critical because you are going to lose more people than you should. And you're going to have a lot of crises of transition unless you're really well prepared.
Absolutely. Okay, Jim, recently EDSI posted a blog about succession planning, and in it, a hire for the future state philosophy was mentioned. What does this mean?
So yeah, that's a really good question because this is an area that we see organizations fail all the time when they're doing succession planning. Think about this. You might have in your company a strategic plan, and part of your strategic plan is that you may be growing and diversifying. Well, if you think about 5 years out, you probably need different skills, different numbers of people with different skill sets to support that different organization, whether you've diversified or grown. Too often we just look at where are we today and making sure that we can cover those critical roles today. Part of succession planning, and this feeds into what we call strategic workforce planning, is really looking out to the future also to say, hey, there might even be a position that I don't even have today that I need to be preparing somebody for, or at least recruiting for, so that I can achieve my goals as a company.
What seems so wise, it seems kind of like insurance. You're putting insurance into your company by always having a backup plan in case something goes wrong.
Really good way to look at it, Beth, and that's exactly right.
Listen, my mom was a banker and I have so many forms of insurance. I even have identity theft insurance because she drilled it in my brain. You need to be prepared for anything. So that's what made me think of that. Well, Jim, we're going to take a sponsorship break right now, but when we get back, we'll go into more detail with what's involved in putting together a corporate succession plan, so stay with us. Thanks to this week's Project HR sponsor, LaborWise Leadership. LaborWise Leadership provides your frontline leaders with the knowledge they need to help you avoid third-party interference in your business. With this powerful online course, you'll teach your leaders how to create greater engagement while remaining union-free. Get your free trial at projectionsinc.com/LaborWise. We're back with Jim Bitterle, Managing Partner of EDSI. All right, Jim, so clearly we need a plan. Can you walk us through the steps of putting a succession plan together?
Sure. And Beth, one of the things about succession planning is we often think it's really a basic process. There's really a fair amount to it, which is why I always encourage HR professionals to really lead this effort so that they do it properly. And, so we kind of break it down into about 16 different steps, but let me walk you through what that looks like.
Okay.
First, we have to assign a champion. Who's going to own it? Somebody needs to be the person that's the go-to person that's going to coordinate and make sure that it happens. And this is really prep work, right? And then you got to make sure you got leadership buy-in because it's going to take time, money, and resources. So we say once you've got that, right, you've got the organization is bought in, make sure you've documented your current culture and your structure. What does your structure look like? What are the positions, who reports to who, who's in each of those positions? Once you've done that, going back to your earlier question, create your future org structure. What is it going to look like in 5 years to support your strategic plan? So now you've kind of created what we call the current state and the future state. And then you want to make sure you have documented or updated all of your job descriptions because it's going to be critical that for especially for those key positions, that you have an accurate and an active job description that people are actually using and living by. Because if you prepare for somebody for a job that doesn't really match what somebody else is doing, then we've missed the boat. So make sure that the job descriptions are accurate. The next step, make sure that you identify critical positions that require successors. Look, some positions just simply don't need to be built into the succession plan because they are positions that maybe you could fill very easily and very quickly, right? We want to really look for those positions that are critical, that are going to require a successor, and without having that succession plan in place, you're going to have difficulty. The next step, this is step 7, identify success profiles for all critical positions. This is interesting to me because when I look at succession plans at different companies, usually the smaller the company, they don't even have succession plans or they've thought about it. The bigger the organization, they're generally more well thought out and there's greater clarity of their succession plan. But I see this missing in all sizes of organizations. What is the success profile for that critical position? So it's not just what responsibilities are they going to have, it's responsibilities, it's tasks, what capabilities do they have? What behaviors do they have? What credentials do they have? Are they a cultural fit? We did a succession planning exercise with a very large consumer product company a few years ago. And we were talking to the head of their franchise operations. And this gentleman had been with the company since the beginning. And it was very, very interesting because he was in his 80s and he was unfortunately diagnosed with cancer. So he was going to be leaving the organization because of an illness. And he basically said, look, everybody in this company thinks that this person A, is the person that should take over my role when I leave. And he goes, they're wrong. And here's why. Because person B, although they may not have all the skills at this time, person B is the perfect cultural fit and will be really well accepted by the organization. So this creating a success profile is such a critical step. Step 8 is then really once you've kind of identified all of your critical positions, you've created or you've built success profiles, identify 1 to 2 successors for all of your critical positions.
Oh, that's good.
And then what we do is step 9 is a gap analysis. Take those successors and assess them. How do they fit to that success profile and what are their gaps? Once you've done that, it starts to become pretty clear. And we always encourage organizational interviews too. Is this individual going to be a cultural fit? Will they be accepted by the organization if they are selected as the successor? Once that's done, pick that successor and then build a development plan for that person so that when it's time for them to take over the new role, they're going to be successful. Let me give you a real quick example. We see salespeople getting promoted because they've been great, right, as a salesperson. They get promoted to be a sales manager and then they fail. And the role between being a salesperson and a sales manager has a huge gap, right? They're very different jobs.
Mm-hmm.
And what we see is companies take a great salesperson, and the next thing you know, they negatively impact the company and their career by putting them into a sales manager role when they're not ready for that role. So
Mm-hmm.
it's probably the biggest issue that we see in succession planning on a broad basis.
I actually come from the sales world. That I did that for years, and I can personally attest that just because you are excellent in sales does not mean that you are excellent at managing other people.
Yeah, great point, Beth. It just, we see it all the time. We see it with salespeople, we see it with engineers. It seems like sales and engineering are the two where we really see a high level of excellent salespeople, excellent engineers moving into a management role and being and failing miserably.
I can so see that. What is next on the list for the checklist for succession planning?
Sure. So once we've assessed the successor, create a development plan. But there's one element that we do overlapping here too, and that is you want to capture knowledge, institutional knowledge from the individual that we're planning to replace, right? So we want to make sure that we interview them and really make sure that we've not lost any knowledge or institutional knowledge, competitive knowledge, company knowledge, et cetera. And we want to build that into those plans. So once we've done that interview and we've captured that knowledge, then we want to really sort of kind of build the plan, make sure the plan is ready to go for the successor. And really then we document and communicate all phases of the plan. So everybody knows who's responsible, who are the key successors, what are their development plans. And then we recommend building an implementation plan, sharing it with all the critical people, and then you implement. So it's a fairly complex process, but it doesn't need to be overly complex because at the end of the day, it's something that's so important to the continuity of your organization.
Yeah.
Really requires the attention and resources that your organization should give it.
Right. Well, I appreciate all of the attention that you have put into that list that you gave us because I feel like this is so critical that you must be thorough.
Correct. Yeah. And it's kind of going back to what I've said before, there are always more urgent fires that you have to fight on any given day. But the day that somebody leaves your organization that's in a critical role, that becomes the biggest fire of that day. And unfortunately, getting that successor into that role and prepared properly isn't something that you can do overnight.
Right. I have a question about the success profiles that you were talking about, identifying those. Who usually weighs into that? Is that the actual position itself, the person who currently has that title, plus HR? Or is it primarily HR that kind of writes the description of that person's profile?
So it's a combination of HR, it's a combination of then interviewing that individual,
That's great.
really getting a deep understanding of what they do, how they do it, and how they do it successfully. In some situations where it's highly critical, we interview other folks that work with that individual to try to understand, what is their secret sauce to being successful in their role.
Yeah, that's really good. I can absolutely see why HR plays a critical role in this effort. It seems like it starts from day one of a hire.
Oh yeah, look, you're always looking when you hire somebody, you're hiring them right to fill a current role.
Hmm.
But Good HR teams in their recruiting and hiring process are also looking at career paths to figure out, hey, we want to make sure that we're not hiring somebody in and they're going to be in that job for 30 years. We want that person to grow and develop and proceed along a career path over time that will then tie directly into the succession plan.
Okay, so I know a lot of companies have been wrestling with this in recent weeks as we are currently recording in the midst of the COVID-19 crisis. But when you are pinpointing your succession candidates for these critical roles, are you always identifying long-term replacements, or are you determining emergency replacements in the event of such a crisis?
Really good question and timely question, right? At the end of the day, when we've identified the successor,
Mhm.
to be realistic that it's not a perfect world, right? And things will happen that are unexpected. So that successor may get thrust into that role really sometimes years before they're really ready for that role. And oftentimes we don't have a better candidate. Now, if it's critical and that candidate is just not even close to being ready, then oftentimes we have to go to the outside. So it can alter the plan a little bit. But there are times, yeah, when people get thrust into a role that they're not ready for. And as the manager of that person, we need to be conscious of, look, this person still needs more development, and we got to help them develop as they go. And we need to try to get them as much assistance as possible through the process, because it does happen, right? I mean,
Mhm.
gosh, right now with the crisis we're going through, unfortunately, we're losing some people to an early death that we
Mhm.
never would have expected. And suddenly we have people being thrust into roles that they were not quite ready for, and nobody expected that they'd get thrown into that role as soon as they did.
Right. Well, in your opinion, are inside candidates preferred over external in creating such plans as these?
That's a that's a tough question, right? Because it depends on your organization. If you have a plan and you're developing people for that role, usually you want to use the inside folks. But I'm a huge proponent of seeding organizations with some people from the outside, because what happens when organizations only feed from the inside is they can begin to become too insular and they lose outside perspective and knowledge. So bringing in expertise from the outside can be very, very beneficial. And I really recommend a mix.
Mhm. Well, it seems like a lot of conversations must be had to create this plan. First and foremost, I would assume there would need to be conversations with the folks flagged as likely to leave. How are those conversations approached? That seems
uh,
tricky.
Yeah, you have to do it delicately, right? With older workers, I think you have to make them understand that, look, your role has been identified as a critical role. So thank you. You've been performing a role that has been so important to this company for many years. Thank you. Now, if you leave, or if you got hit by a bus tomorrow, it's going to negatively impact the company, your coworkers, your friends that are here at work. So we need you to help us mentor the right successor through the process of getting them ready. And we try to phrase it as almost a mentoring scenario. So they can take that person under their wing and feel good that they are developing that person. Usually with the older workers, I always like to say, you know, think about it as if you had a son or a daughter in the company and that was this person, how would you want their mentor to treat them? And so we try to get them in the frame of mind where they're really feeling a sense of responsibility to make sure that this person is well prepared and well taken care of in the process. And we also like to say, look, we're not asking you to retire. We love you. We think you're great, but we've got a plan, right? When do you think you're going to retire? What's reasonable for us in terms of a time frame so we can work with that. In other critical roles where maybe it's not somebody that's an older employee, it might be somebody that's 40 years old, but they have a very critical role in the company. I think you have to play to their sense of, yeah, I do have a critical role in this company, and if something were to happen to me, gosh, I better make sure I have somebody prepared. And oftentimes we encourage the succession planners to talk about, hey, something bad could happen to you. That would be awful. But you also, it's going to be very difficult for us to promote you, right? If there's nobody to take your role,
Hmm.
something very directly in it for them by understanding that it's hard to promote you unless you've got somebody ready to go to fill your role when the time comes.
Okay, so based on everything that we have been talking about, I can tell that a big part of succession planning really is taking this 30,000-foot view of where we are and where we're going, right?
Correct.
In our last episode, we talked with Dr. Edie Goldberg about identifying current skill gaps and anticipating future ones. And I never thought about it, but succession planning could tie into this as well, right?
Oh, absolutely. What we call it skill gap analysis. And that's a critical element of succession planning, right? Because as I talked earlier about creating a success profile for a key position, a skill gap analysis is part of that, right? You want to identify what are their skill sets and what level of competency do they have for each of their key skills. And then you want to actually compare one of the successors or multiple successors to that skill gap profile or that skill profile, to make sure that you've identified what are the skills gaps that those people have. When you identify the skills gaps, then what you do is you build that into the development plan for the successor.
Okay, so once a plan is in place, is that it or does it need regular updating?
Um, so unfortunately, we see organizations, they go through this process, they create their succession plan, and then, it sits there, right? There are two critical elements. One is you have to make sure that then the development plans are being implemented. And two, you have to make sure that on an ongoing basis, you're going back and taking a look at the plan to make sure it's still relevant because things happen, right?
Hmm.
Um, Acquisition is made. Maybe different people have left. Maybe some of your key successors have left the organization. So you need to go back and find new successors for a critical role. So it really needs to be looked at regularly. We encourage people to take a summary view of that every year just to make sure that there are no critical changes that need to be updated.
I can see that because, I mean, even as technology changes, I can imagine that every critical position is going to evolve often.
That's correct. Yeah.
Right. Well, Jim, it's time now for a very quick break, but we'll be right back after this. You're listening to the Project HR podcast. I'm your host, Beth Pilgreen, and our guest today is Jim Bitterle, Managing Partner of EDSI. We are back. I've been thinking about that 30,000-foot view that we mentioned earlier. Succession planning also allows us to craft changes beyond skill bases because succession planning can actually direct corporate culture, like what we've said. For instance, if we take a look at that view and see that we're lacking in, say, gender diversity or emotional intelligence, we could feed that into the succession process as well and hire for that future state. Can you talk a little bit about that?
So, Beth, I love that question because I think that great organizations are very intentional about building a culture, building a great culture where people are engaged and people feel great about the organization they work for. And when you think about succession planning, part of the success profile that we build for every critical role should have a cultural element. What is a cultural fit for that job? Because it's very easy to put somebody that might be a non cultural fit or worse, cultural poison into a critical role and really have a very negative impact on the organization. So, today and as we go forward in the future, building a great culture is more important than it ever has been because you want to attract and retain the best people you can. And having a great culture helps you do that. And building the cultural element into the succession planning piece is, I can't state enough how important that is.
Yeah. Well, I would assume that everybody that's listening too would conclude with that too. This seems essential. I mean, succession planning is a tremendous job involving what seems like a lot of moving parts and a great deal of time and effort. It's no wonder that companies often look outside for a little help in putting all of this in motion. And Jim, one of the services your company, EDSI, provides is succession planning assistance. Can you talk a little bit more about what that looks like?
Yeah, we do a fair amount of succession planning, and we can do different levels of planning, right? We can just coach you through the process. For smaller companies, we can actually do that remotely, where we had an organization up in just outside of Regina, Saskatchewan. We're headquartered in Michigan, and instead of spending a ton of money traveling, we did it all virtually, and we coached them through the process. And then some companies need us to really be the project manager and get deep involved, all the way through turnkey, where we will manage and run the entire process and then make sure that it's updated on a regular basis.
That's awesome.
Thank you for that question, because there are lots of different options for companies that are thinking about going through this process.
What do you think for those that are listening and wondering if they should bring in a service like yours for their company, what are the benefits of hiring an outside SP consultant like you guys?
Yeah, I think the big thing is look at it as risk, right? When we all we buy insurance, right, for our cars, for our homes, for our businesses. This is insurance. If you do this wrong, it can be critical,
Hmm.
especially in smaller privately held organizations. The 60% failure rate and the nearly 90% failure rate going from Gen 2 to Gen 3, the cost to your organization, maybe to your retirement, is dramatic. So although it costs money to do this, it's a drop in the bucket in terms of the cost that could be there if you don't do this and don't do it right.
Right. Absolutely. I would much rather hire a service like this, experts who know exactly what you guys are doing. You have years of experience than just try and blindly pick myself in my corporation. And with your company, I understand companies can either hire you to run the whole succession planning process, or they can hire you to handle certain tasks and aspects of the process. Is that right?
That's correct. Yeah. And it can be everything from just coaching you through the process all the way to turnkey. We'll do all pieces of it. Our goal is to help you get through it the right way and to provide the resources you need when you need them.
That's great. Well, how can interested listeners learn more about EDSI?
So, two ways. Our website, EDSIsolutions.com, is a great place to start. You can find our contact details on the website, or you can call me or email me. And again, those details are on the website, and I can be reached via email at jbitterle@edsisolutions.com.
Cool. Thank you for that. And Jim, before we go into the lightning round questions, I want to mention you have something very exciting happening in 60 days. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, we have a book launching. It's called Unquittable, and it is related to attracting and retaining the best talent possible. There is a chapter on succession planning, but we recognize that there is a war for talent that has been going on during this recession. Some steam will come out of the kettle for that.
Hmm.
But as the recession ends, we'll be right back into the war for talent. It will be worse. And this book is really geared to help you win the war for talent.
It sounds like a pivotal launch at a pivotal time. Where can people find out more about where to purchase that book?
You can go to our website, you can go to Amazon, or you can go to Sherm and find the book in one of those three places.
Awesome. And as always, for our listeners, that information will be included in this episode's companion guide. So don't forget to sign up for it at projectionsinc.com/podcast. But we are not done with the interview yet, Jim, because as you know, it is time for our lightning round questions. These are the questions we ask every guest of the podcast. Are you ready?
I am ready.
Okay. Topic showdown. In this episode, we discussed succession planning. In your opinion, which of these fictional offices are most in need of a succession plan? The Springfield Nuclear Power Plant in The Simpsons, or the office workplace Dunder Mifflin?
Dunder Mifflin, of course. No. You know what? Succession planning at a nuclear power plant is probably a little more important than a paper company.
What's the worst job interview question you've ever been asked?
Oh my goodness. Okay, so it wasn't me, but I sat through an interview that I observed one of my clients interviewing an executive candidate. And it wasn't that there were bad questions, it was that there were no questions.
What?
He talked the entire time and proceeded to tell the candidate everything that he wanted to hear. So he basically told him what he wanted to hear and asked no questions.
Oh.
Maybe the worst interview I've ever seen done.
Yeah, I can see that. That sounds pretty bad. What's your favorite thing about working as a consultant?
You know, there are two things, really. One is I just love the variety. We work with all different industries, but I love helping people. So to me, I feel really gratified when I know we've helped a company and we've helped individuals so that they can really succeed in what they're trying to do.
What's the best piece of advice you've ever been given?
Well, I grew up in a family business, and I worked for my dad. So talk about succession planning.
Wow, really? Yeah.
There. And when I was very young, one of the things my dad told me was, Jim, in any company, you can learn something from anybody in that organization. So he was treat everybody with respect and always be open to learning from anybody, from somebody that's the sweeper all the way to the CEO. And I think that's great advice, and it's held to be very true throughout my entire career.
Wow, that's awesome. Who or what inspires you, Jim?
Oh boy, I love music, so I find music can be very inspirational to me. So probably that on a lot of different levels.
Oh, I love that. Me too, actually. My dad was a musician.
Oh, good. Yeah, I play multiple instruments, and I'm learning to record at home. So that is just an absolute blast.
It's so fun. Well, Jim, thanks for joining me today on this week's episode of Project HR. It was a pleasure getting to talk to you and learn more about your business.
Thank you, Beth. It was great talking to you as well.
I'd also like to thank our listeners as well. And again, don't forget to grab the companion for this episode at projectionsinc.com/podcast. Remember, if you'd like to be on Project HR or know someone who would, feel free to email us at projecthr@projectionsinc.com. Last but not least, don't forget to rate us on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcast content so that other folks can find us. Well, that's it from me for now. Let's make it a great and safe day at work.